of a woman who was a refugee from the Galilee. She fled by foot from Galilee. Israelis were shooting at people to make them leave the village. She had two babies with her, her two daughters. They were both killed. She arrived in Lebanon, lived in a refugee camp. Her husband joined her in a year, and then they had seven more children, four of them boys. And the Lebanese and Israelis kidnapped the four boys, and she never saw them again. It's a very sad story. Um, okay, this is called Dying Again, Memories of Freedom in Gaza by Ramzi Baroud. When you have no frame of reference for the concept of freedom, perhaps its absence is not so painful. My mother and father's generation lived in their own homes, on their own land. Their life was very simple, but it was still a life of dignity. I often ponder how the last 6 decades in refugee camps have been much more painful for the elderly than they have been for the young, who cannot fathom what it must be like to live outside the walls and barbed wire barricades of our open air prison called Gaza. Living under occupation, Israeli occupation, means you live a life of uncertainty. You don't know when you wake up each morning, if there will be electricity, or if the Israelis have shut it off as a form of collective punishment. You don't know if the schools will be open, or if the Israelis close them all for a day, a month, or a year as a form of collective punishment. You don't know if you can walk to the corner shop to buy food for your family, or if all the shops have been closed for a day, a week, or a month as a form of collective punishment. You don't know if the Israelis will permit you to go across town to visit friends or family, or if they have imposed a curfew for a day, a week, a month, or more as a form of collective punishment. You don't know if they will permit you to go to the hospital when you are ill. If you cannot be treated and you die, it is uncertain whether they will allow for your burial, because the graveyards are closed as a form of collective punishment. It is difficult to plan for the future because you don't know if they will permit you to live to see the future. As children, my father shared with my siblings and me endless stories of life in his village of Beit Daras before the Israelis came and everything changed. I feel that it was his attempt to explain what life was like in the real world, how it should have been for all of us. As a young man, I'd always aspired to be like my dad, to take a stand for my people and their freedom. That the day arrived when I was a young man. It was in 1987 and the first Intifada had broken out. It seems that the Palestinians had grown weary of sharing nostalgic stories of the days of freedom with their children, and that their children wanted a hands-on experience with freedom themselves. Our decision came at a heavy price, and many people died. On this particular morning, Israeli soldiers killed a young man from my school. Our school was closed to mourn the falling of our classmate, but everyone arrived anyway, determined to hold our occupiers to account. Our numbers grew as the jeeps and tanks arrived. I was terrified as I picked up a stone, but stood still. Others ran away, but some ran towards the soldiers with the rocks and flags. The soldiers drew nearer. They looked frightening and foreign, but when the kids ran in the direction of the soldiers and rocks began flying everywhere, I was no longer anxious. I belonged there. I ran into the inferno with my school bag in one hand and a stone in the other. Allahu Akbar, I cried, which means God is great. And I threw my stone. I hit the target, but the rock fell just a short distance ahead of me. But I felt liberated, no longer a negligible refugee standing in a long line before a United Nations Reliefs and Works Agency feeding center for a bag of rice or powdered milk. Engulfed by my own rebellious feelings, I picked up another stone and a third. I moved forward even as bullets flew, even as my friends began falling all around me. I could finally articulate who I was, and for the first time on my own terms. My name was Ramzi, and I was the son of Muhammad, a freedom fighter from the Sayrat refugee camp who was driven out of his village and was buried village of Beit Daras, and the grandson of a peasant who died with a broken heart and was buried beside the grave of my brother, the little boy who died because there was no medicine in the refugee camp's UN clinic. My mother was Zarafe, a refugee who couldn't spell her name, whose literacy set was compensated by a heart overflowing with love for her children, and a woman who had the patience of a prophet. I was a free boy. In fact, I was a free man. Since I'm getting upset, I'm going to pass the book and let some of you read it paragraph by paragraph. Do you want to start here?
But the morning came when my father's ingenuity could no longer protect his family. A large boot pressing against my face awakened me. A swarm, a swarm of soldiers were standing over me. My mother came running from the kitchen to find an Israeli army unit handcuffing her children and dragging them out into the street. The event was customary. Soldiers often stormed into people's homes and broke the arms and legs of men and boys so as to send a stern message to the rest of the neighborhood that they would receive the same fate if they continued with their intifada. Israeli Defense Minister Yitzhak Rabin called this mistreatment his break their bone policy. Unable to speak a single sentence in Hebrew, my mother let out a howl and cried out to one of them in Arabic, "I beg you, soldiers, my sons were sleeping. They have done nothing wrong. I kiss your hand. Don't break their arms. I beg you. May Allah return you safe and sound to your family." How would your mother feel if someone came to break her children's arms? Oh Allah, come to my rescue. My children are the only thing I have in this life. Oh Allah, I was raised poor and orphaned, and I don't deserve this. At first, the soldiers paid no heed to my mother's pleas and merely responded with "Shut up and go inside." But her crying alerted the women in the neighborhood who served as a first line of defense under such circumstances. Neighborhood women gathered outside their homes, screaming and shouting as soldiers lined against the wall and brought in their clubs. The custom was for the soldiers to ask a person singled out for a beating, "Which hand do you write with?" before the club would break, followed by the other arms and then the legs. When the soldiers asked one of my brothers the same ominous question, my mother's pleas turned into unintelligible cries as she dropped to the floor and held onto one of the soldier's legs with a death grip. The soldier tried to free himself as two others came to his rescue, pounding the frail woman over and over again in the chest with the butts of their machine guns. And as my father forced his body between the angry soldiers and the desperate mother, made more courageous by the violent scene, especially as my mother seemed to be drowning in the gush of blood flowing from her mouth, neighborhood women drew closer, throwing rocks and sand at the soldiers. What was meant as an elderly beating of several boys turned into a chaotic scene where women braved guns and tear gas and verbal abuse by Israeli soldiers who eventually retreated into their military vehicle and out of the area. Thanks to my mother, our bones were left intact that day, but at a price. She was left bruised and bleeding. Her chest was battered and several ribs were broken. She was rushed to a local hospital and was incapacitated for days. Her health deteriorated to the bewilderment of Ahli hospital doctors who hoped for an eventual recovery. Days later, doctors discovered that my mother had multiple myeloma. Apparently, she had been sick for some time, but her illness was exacerbated by the violent encounter which made her prognosis bleak. Nusrat was under a curfew, which meant that if you braved going outdoors, you risked being arrested or shot by occupation forces. The Israeli army agreed to allow her burial on the condition that only the immediate family was to be present under the monitoring of Israeli soldiers. We arrived at the graveyard carrying the coffin and were soon joined by grandmother Maryam, who came running into the graveyard calling out her daughter's name. We began digging, but neighbors peeking through their windows quickly concluded that Zarafa had died and was being buried. My mother was a beloved neighbor. She was particularly adored among the older women of the camp, who she treated with untold kindness. Allahu Akbar resonated a voice coming from one of the refugee homes. Umma Anwar has died. Within minutes, shouts of God is great echoed through the camp. It is a call to prayer and also a call to action. People appeared from everywhere, carrying Palestinian flags, women, children, old men and women, and youth, all descending onto the graveyard. Refugees were outraged that the poor woman was to be buried based on military instructions and that she was followed even to her grave under the watchful eyes of the occupiers, their guns, tanks, and a hovering army helicopter.